Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter Select, a seasonal podcast where we bounce back and forth between a series, exploring its evolution, design, and legacy. For Season 4, we are covering the Fast and the Furious series. I am one of your hosts, Max Roberts, and I am joined, as always, by Logan Moore. Hi, Logan.
Max, I live my life one podcast recording at a time or something, however the quote goes. I'm sure he says it in the other movies.
Quarter mile at a time.
Yeah.
So like a quarter of a podcast at a time? Would that be the equivalent?
I guess it would be probably just one podcast is maybe
one
that's
podcast
cool
at a
trade-off.
time?
One podcast recording at a time is how I live my life.
Could you imagine recording multiple podcasts at once?
No.
I don't know if that's
in what
possible.
manner, though? I used to record like 5 or 6 a week at one point, which
No,
was...
I mean at once. Just different shows.
That'd be really interesting, actually. I would like to try that. Try to keep up with 2 different conversations going on at a single time. Podcasting while you're podcasting.
It's a true podcaster's challenge.
I think back in the day, I probably could have done that, if I'm being totally honest. Back when I was in college and I was seriously running, we had our whole ring of shows that we ran, and then I was doing some other
You were at least on
video
4 or 5
gamer
at
ones.
once.
Yeah, I was on like 5 at once at one time, which was, I don't know how I did that. And then I was going to college, and then I was playing 80 video games a year or whatever. I don't know.
Oh, jeez, so much.
I think about that sometimes, how we used to do that, and I don't, or at least I used to do that, and I don't understand how I did.
You used to play a lot of games every year.
I did, yeah. And now this year, I think I looked at my list the other day, and I've played about 12 so far this year. And 4 of those have been Banjo-Kazooie games. So
I'm at 19.
And a Conquer.
I'm at 19. I mean, so Season 4 here, we kind of said in Episode 0, we've never done movies before, but movies were always part of the plan from the show's inception. And the reason we're doing it now is because watching 10 movies, roughly 2 hours apiece, is about 20-hour commitment, which is the length of one Paper Mario game. And all of that extra time is going to allow us to do some personal things in our lives, like move and have a child, but also let us prepare a bigger, more ambitious first season for next year, which is going to be Season 5, which is Resident Evil. So that's part of why we chose this. But also, Logan's never seen these movies. I've seen them all multiple times. It's time to bring Logan into the family properly.
yeah, I'm excited to do this. We talked up front about we talked in the episode 0, if you listen to that or not, how you're kind of the expert on this one, and the Resident Evil series I'll be the expert on. So please shepherd me through this world of cars and street racing and robbery and other things. Corona beers, I guess.
Corona, baby. You can have anything you want as long as it's a Corona.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I'm so excited.
As far as the structure of these episodes is going to go, though, so we are switching to movies. We are going to structure them in the same way, though, that we have been in our past seasons. So if you've listened to anything we've done with God of War, The Last of Us, Paper Mario, or Banjo-Kazooie, which was our last season, we're still going to break these episodes down on the same way, which means we're going to lay the groundwork here for The Fast and the Furious, which is the first episode in the series, first movie in the series, I should say, and it came out all the way back on June 22nd, 2001, which was my 7th birthday. This movie came out on my birthday. I share a birthday with The Fast and Furious, which is interesting because the series started on the same day. So
what a day. A historic day, some may say.
Yeah, I don't know what I was doing on my 7th birthday, but I do remember seeing commercials for this film, which we can talk about in a second. It was directed by Rob Cohen, produced by Neil H. Moritz. The writers on the film were Gary Scott Thompson, Eric Bergquist, and David Ayer. David Ayer was working on this. I forgot about that. The primary actors in the film, obviously, we can list a lot of people here, but you got Vin Diesel, Paul Walker, Michelle Rodriguez, and then Jordana Brewster. The composer of The Fast and the Furious goes by BT. His full name is Brian Wayne Transeau. We wanted to bring up the stunt coordinator this time around because this will be a big, important aspect of these movies moving forward. The stunt coordinator for this one is, I believe it would just be Mike Mike Rogers. I don't think it's either Mike or Mick. I don't know.
MIC.
Spelled would be short for microphone, but so we'll say Mike. The budget for this movie, it was $38 million, and it made $207.3 million at the box office, which explains some things to me, which we can talk about in a second. Mm-hmm. And the Rotten Tomatoes score for this one, which is what we're going to go off of this season rather than Metacritic, which is what we usually do with video games. The critics score on this was ended up slotting at a 54% overall, which is not good. But audiences liked it a little bit more, as it sat at a 74, which is moderately better.
Does Rotten Tomatoes cut off the time for user reviews? Because I wonder if there's like been a little bit of revisionist history here with people coming back and rating it higher because of the love of the series.
I'm not sure. I've never been a Rotten Tomatoes person or even a Metacritic person when I'm rating these things.
Same.
I think you can do it whenever, though, to my knowledge.
Okay, so there's a lot here. I think kind of the big stuff is definitely the actors and the budget, because we will quickly see the budget explode and the return on investment also explode.
Well, I want to state something up front. I want to hone in on the Rotten Tomatoes score and just the average general consensus here, because I told you there was one thing I wanted to mention up front in this episode, which I didn't tell you beforehand. Yes. But again, I know nothing about any of these movies. And all I know is that it is one of the biggest film franchises in history. It's up there with Star Wars and Marvel and Rocky, like all these like multi-sequel film franchises. Like, it is one of the largest movie franchises in history. My hypothesis before watching any of these movies is that this is the worst mass blockbuster film franchise in existence. And by that, I mean both like how it began, because it's very bizarre. This franchise is different because the one thing I do know from the outside looking in is that it's like the JRPG of film franchises, in the sense that people are always like, oh, well, it gets really good if you just get to about the 5th or the 6th one. It's very much like somebody trying to sell you on playing Final Fantasy 15 and saying, oh, it gets pretty good once you're about 25 hours in. So I'm fascinated that this series has stuck around as long as it has, when I see that the critics and even the audience, like I know 74% on Rotten Tomatoes or whatever, and that's just a small look at what people think about this movie. But even that's not super high. Like you brought up that you thought people would maybe be going back and giving it a way higher score. I think it was pretty, even back in the day when I was a kid, I don't remember people really freaking out about this movie that much. I mean, obviously it made 4 or 5 times the budget that went into it, which is good, and that explains how sequels came about and stuff like that. But when you think about these sprawling film franchises, how they started, like Star Wars became so big because the original Star Wars is a great movie. Rocky is so big. Oh, the original Rocky is one of the best, most lauded movies of all time. Won Academy Awards. Like this, it's like the starting point for this is this movie, which made a decent amount of money compared to how much they spent on it, but largely people just kind of shrugged their shoulders and went go see a summer film and then went home. And that's my impression from the outside looking in, at least. So
I'm so curious to see how this evolves, your opinion evolves over the course of this season as you watch more movies, because there's a key turning point, and the way our season is structured, you're actually not going to see the turning point until later in the season with Tokyo Drift. So it kind of, and then Fast 4 or Fast and Furious sets essentially the tone going forward. And you'll see that here as we go through these movies, but you are coming in with the Fast and the Furious as your only input. And
but that's how I guess that's what I'm saying is that's how it would have been for anybody. Mm-hmm. Like this is the order they released it. Like, how did this go on to spawn this huge, mega successful movie franchise where we're going to have 12 or 13 movies, and we're on 10 total, 11, which is Fast 10, and Fast 10's 2 parts, or Fast 10 and 11, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's 12 or 13 movies total, I guess, and all
a
of this.
TV show and games, and theme park ride.
And the starting point is just this movie. Like that's what I'm trying to express. Is that it's crazy that this mega successful media franchise, the starting point is this movie that got middling responses from both critics and audiences. Again, people don't hate it, but it's just kind of a thing you would go, oh, I'll go see this car movie at the theaters. And then skip forward 20 years and it's one of the biggest properties on the planet. It's like, huh? What? Like, it doesn't track with how we've seen a lot of other franchises blow up.
I think we'll touch on it in this episode, I believe, and then it definitely obviously is a theme going forward. But I mean, you've talked about it as really one of your only frames of reference is the family. There is a nugget in this movie that I think resonates on some just Hollywood entertain the masses level of just unity and banding together type stuff. I mean, I'm not saying Fast and Furious is Star Wars, but that's part of Star Wars is this ragtag group coming together and overcoming something. Or, you know, Avatar is technically a ragtag. These different things. It's just kind of coarse human storytelling and what they eventually do with that over time. We'll explore it, but the theme of family is definitely essential here.
And I'm not even trying to undersell this movie because I actually kind of like this movie.
This movie is fun.
Yeah, we'll get into it here. Before we talk too much about just our general thoughts, let's go into our own histories with this. Again, I don't know if you have a more extensive one than I do. I actually do have a history with this, sort of.
I'm excited to hear this. I want to hear what you have to say. My history with this particular film isn't that exciting. So
the only history I have with this is I just remember when it was coming out. I remember seeing commercials and trailers for it and not thinking much of it. But this is the reason this stands out in my head, is that my grandpa really wanted to see this movie. And if you know my grandparents, both sets of my grandparents, I'd say my grandparents on my mom's side are a little bit more, they're not like pop culture savvy or something or anything like that. My grandparents on my dad's side, like they'll go see Marvel movies and like if it was my dad's dad who was like, oh, I want to go see the Fast and Furious, in my mind I'd be like, okay, that tracks. For some reason though, I have this clear image in my head of being at my mom's parents' house, my mom's side grandparents, and my grandpa, who probably would have been mid to late 60s but when this came out, was like, oh, I want to go see this movie, The Fast and the Furious. And I was like, what? And so I just remember we went to the movie theater at one point, and I actually tried to look this up the other day to go see, because I went to the movie theater and I would have gone to go see something with my grandma, and then he went to go see a showing of this, and he may have gone with like my uncle or something like that too. And I just remember that we went to the movie theater and split up, and he went to go see this, and I went to go see something with my grandma. And I even looked up like what movies were coming out around the same time as this that I would have maybe gone to go see. And I couldn't find anything that really like rang a bell. But I do have a distinct memory of going to the theater, and he went to go see this movie, and he was like, yeah, it was okay afterwards. But again, it's funny. That's so funny. If you know my grandparents that I'm referring to, because he is not the kind of person who would ever, like, if I think about my grandpa, like the last thing I would ever think about is street racing, like youthful, I don't know, a bunch of young 20-somethings racing cars in the streets of LA movie, and how somehow he's interested by that and wants to go see it. Yeah, I guess that my whole experience with this movie is just that. And then I guess to throw it out there, this is the only movie I've seen before in the franchise. I mentioned that this is all new to me. I have seen this movie before.
You watched it last year.
Yeah. I watched it last year with the attempt of trying to finally watch all of them in the franchise. I watched the first one, never watched any of them again after that, and now we're turning it into content on this here podcast. So this is the one I have seen before, which is kind of funny that I have seen this movie twice, but I've never seen literally anything else now.
Oh, that's going to be good. My history with this film is honestly boring. My first Fast and Furious movie is actually Too Fast, Too Furious, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. But this just kind of retroactively came into my life. I watched Too Fast. I would have watched Tokyo, and I just watched this movie at some point. It's just kind of been there since the Fast and Furious entered my life. The first movie has just kind of been around. So it's not. I don't remember the first time I saw this because it wasn't my first exposure. So I've just always kind of had some level of a soft spot for this movie simply because it is the first and there are some moments that I particularly care for. But yeah, my history of this movie is fairly straightforward. It's just retroactive exposure. What
is your general impressions of the movie then? I think we both touched on that we like it up top, or a couple minutes ago we mentioned that, but how do you feel about it overall, especially since you've seen all the other ones? Like, I don't necessarily need your ranking within the larger franchise, but
right. There's a level of purity here. Cars are a main character. Like when we were listing actors, the fifth one could have been Cars. Cars just play a role, and there's just a level of amateur is not the right word, but it's young. There's just, I guess it was appealing to a younger audience and your grandfather, but there's this younger vibe to it. Cars are essential to the plot, but there's this layer of crime and undercover cops and all this other stuff that just kind of is in there. But cars are still always the focus, and you'll see how that changes over the course of the series. But there is a level of purity here. There's, this budding love story, and one guy's big tough macho and thinks like the girl belongs to him. There's this, I'll never go back to jail. There's just this wholesomeness to it that I find endearing, especially looking back on where all these movies end up going. There's just something about it.
The thing I wrote down that is probably best puts into words my feelings on this film is just, I just love the vibe of this movie. I'm nostalgic for this time period, even though I never really lived in it like these people did. Like, that's how I feel. Like, we obviously lived through this era, but we were kids when it was happening, so it wasn't 1-to-1. But I look back on this and I pine for this era of living. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm starting to sound very old, but there are no cell phones in this movie that people are whipping out and filming as the cars drive. Like, it's just people like this was like the last era before things got like really integrated with the internet and we became really interconnected and all of life changed in some major ways that permeate all of culture.
That's one of the things I kind of wrote in the story. There is an angle of old versus new school, like technology and analog. There's this purity in, maybe I have the fanciest car with a computer plugged into like a super nitrous system and it's like calculating all this stuff, versus I just got NOS under the passenger seat. Like, there's this level of, whether you win by an inch or a mile, a win's a win. There's this level of old school and new school coming in that story. And I think that resonates 21 years later, especially for people our age that necessarily were kids at this time. And now we're like, they could cut off an entire street and say, fine, go home, pizza boy. Like, cop, radio, there is this isolation to it. Race wars out in the desert. It's a bygone era.
Yeah, it just feels like, again, it's weird that I am nostalgic for this, but yeah, very much am, even though I was a youth when this came out. It just reminds me of, like, when I think of this time period, I do really think of like this movie. I think of the rise of Grand Theft Auto and hearing about that as a kid and stuff like that. Like, these are the things I think of when I think of the early 2000s. These are the touchstones I have. Before we get too much talking about the story and some of the other aspects of the movie that we either like or dislike, I did want to bring up one thing here, which I wrote down. Which is just how this movie came about. And neither of us would know about this, I think, and maybe I should have researched this before we talked about this, but how did this fascination with street racing really begin in the 90s? Was it this movie, or was it like, I mean, clearly it wasn't. This movie was written off of things that were, or it was based on loosely real things that were happening in the real world. But I don't know.
I mean, car
Obviously,
culture has always been a thing. Since cars are around, cars have been culture.
Yeah.
And touch points there. And street racing evolves out of that. So I think that's a natural progression.
But I remember hearing about street racing even when I was a kid, outside of things like just this movie, you know? And so this movie is definitely based off of a lot of things that would have happened in that era. But is this... I guess my question is, was street racing really big in the 90s, which then led to somebody saying, hey, let's make a street racing movie, which was this? Or was street racing big in part because of this movie? Like that, like it's a chicken and the egg situation. Like, which one really caused the other to happen? And I'm going to assume street racing was already a really big thing in the 90s and early 2000s before this movie ever came about.
So here's what Wikipedia says. Wikipedia coming in. Director Rob Cohen was inspired to make the film after reading a 1998 Vibe magazine article called, quote, Racer X, end quote, about street racing in New York City and watching an actual illegal street race at night in Los Angeles. Okay. With the screenplay originally developed by Gary Scott Thompson and Eric Bergquist. The film's original title was Redline before it was changed to The Fast and the Furious. Thank God.
Well, when you think of things from this area, other pieces of media too, and the reason I'm asking whether or not this movie really contributed to street racing stuff being, whether this was kind of the inception point of that, or if this was kind of the product of things that were already happening, is because if you look back, even in the early 2000s in the video game space, we had a ton of street racing games in the early 2000s in the first 5 or 6 years. Like that's been back when Midnight Club used to be huge. Need for Speed was very much in that same mold back then too. I mean, there was a lot of different racing franchises that kind of came about all at the same time, which were, I mean, just street racing.
Before 2001, there was 5 Need for Speed games. 2 Hot Pursuit, High Stakes, and Porsche Unleashed. So there's this energy to it. Hot Pursuit, especially.
I think Gran Turismo makes an appearance in the movie, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
I think that's part of that car culture as well.
Yeah.
So it definitely sounds like it was
all
inspired.
Clearly flowing. It was all clearly flowing into each other. But this is the big. Unless I'm wrong, again, I was a kid and I have not done thorough research into this topic like I probably should have before we started recording. But this, I mean, when you think of street racing movies and stuff like that, like there's a lot of video games you can point to from back then. But this is really the only movie I can think of that kind of touches on this sort of stuff, which is why I was wondering when this feels like it was early, like 2001 though. This feels like when that stuff was really popping off and getting big. So this kind of came out at a perfect time.
Yeah, capitalizing on the market and just the energy there. And you'll see that continue, especially in Too Fast, Too Furious as well. So
I remember when that movie came out because that was a thing at my school. We'll talk about that next time. I remember kids being interested in that film. Let's talk about the story. And I have a lot of things written down and a lot of things about the plot and the writing. And I don't know where to start. Where do you want to start? What would you like to say about the story stuff first?
Do you just want to kind of go in order here a little bit?
Yeah, let's try to stay. I mean, my notes are in order, so that'd probably help if I'm being honest, rather than jumping around.
I mean, it opens up with 3 black Honda Civics with neon glow. It may not have been Civics, but Hondas with under green light, pursuing a semi truck and trying to hijack it.
And robbing some CRT TVs
and DVD players
That's probably the funniest part of this movie in retrospect, is seeing that they're robbing things that have no value in modern day, or maybe CRTs do. I don't know. You're the one who's got a CRT plugged in your house currently.
They're quite valuable for the right people, but you mass market, no.
I mean, when you see the TVs they're putting in the trucks, though, in this movie, it's like, what? Those are probably the cheapest, crappiest TVs ever. You can still sell them for a lot, but
yeah. So it opens up with that, and then I believe then it cuts right to Brian.
He doesn't want crust on his sandwich. He asks if the tuna is crappy.
You want to start there with the Toretto's Market and Cafe?
Sure. Yeah. The introduction of all these characters.
This is really where we meet everyone, including the fifth star cars. I think that's a really big emphasis here is that them all rolling up. But Brian shows up in his truck and walks in and asks Mia how the tuna is. Apparently he's been coming every day for a bit, getting those tuna fish sandwiches with no crust. I mean, what are you... To me, I'm just seeing like, wow, they're all really young. The dynamics are very interesting, especially knowing where some of these relationships go in the future. So I'm looking at it through this lens of, 20 years of history. But where are you at here?
The thing that stood out to me the most in this scene is I wrote down the line, quote, "What is this guy, sandwich crazy?" That's the thing that stands out to me the most in this scene. I don't know. I think it's funny how they intro Dom, or how they intro Vin Diesel in this movie. It's just he's this brooding character sitting in the back room, and you can only see the back of his head. And they try to play him up as being this intimidating, larger than life figure that is kind of looming in this scene until he eventually makes his appearance towards the end.
He was in my face, man. I'm in your face.
Yeah, they kind of lay a lot of the groundwork for, I mean, obviously Brian and Mia end up being an item later in the movie, but they kind of gloss over their whole like initial infatuation with each other, and just kind of, we pick up here and it's clear that they have a thing for each other already. And so there's really not much to see develop between those characters. We're just kind of dropping in on them and seeing the rapport they've already built up with each other, which is horrible rapport, if I'm being honest. This dude just shows up every day and keeps invoking tuna sandwiches and
no crust. No one likes the tuna.
And they establish that he's been in this place like 3 weeks in a row, and he's still coming in, and all he has to say every day is, "Hey, give me the tuna." It's like, bro, you've been coming in here every day for multiple weeks in a row, and you don't have anything bigger to say to this lady here other than...
But initially, yes, that's the reaction. But hindsight reveals why he goes there every day, and it's interesting. That part is for sure. But then, him and Vince get into the fight, and Dom kind of breaks it up. Letty's like, Dom. They come out, and all these cars roll up, and they're all bright decals on the side. You really don't see cars like that today anywhere. That's not really the style. We're kind of thrust into the middle of a story, really, with the theft, these characters.
Yeah, we see there's very little done from the outset. It just kind of establishes, there's robberies happening, and then we meet this man outside of Dodger Stadium who's trying to race a car and get better at it. Just cool that Dodger Stadium is in this. And then, we're just kind of thrust right into the middle of this, and we kind of piece together a lot of things for ourselves, because obviously what you're hinting at is Brian ends up being a cop, which is revealed later in the movie, but they reveal that at an interesting time, because most other movies you feel like
35 minutes into the movie, I wrote it down. That's a third of the movie.
Yeah. Which is but it's not like, even when they reveal that, it's not like a huge revelation to the audience. I mean, it is, but they don't play it off in such a way like, dun, 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 he's a cop. Oh my gosh. It's just kind of like, oh, yep, very matter of fact. Even though I guess he gets picked up at gunpoint by his partners, which is very bizarre. It's
interesting that that's not really such a shock or a twist to the audience. And I think part of that is the rapport that he's built with these other characters. And you can feel the relationship there. There's more to him than just, I've got to get the guy, I've got to figure out who's stealing all this stuff. And
no, I think that's smart, because it allows the audience to connect with him in such a way too, where when later in the movie, he's like, no, I'm being genuine. I really care about you, Mia, and I want to save Dom, and blah, 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 blah. Like, that he feels those things. And it's because you've kind of had time to sit and stew with him yourself and see how he's interacting with these people. And I think if they would have revealed that he's a cop earlier in the film, then us as the viewers would have thought that he's just trying to play everybody the whole time, and he's just trying to get in their good graces because he's trying to uncover all of this and whatnot.
So, later that night, Brian shows up to a street race in his green Mitsubishi. This is after he goes into work at Racer's Edge and goes, I need NAS. NAS!
This is where Gran Turismo shows up, being played in a car.
That always reminded me of Pimp My Ride. You remember that show on MTV?
Yeah, I used to have a TV in my mom's minivan in the early 2000s.
See, look at you. Pimp My Ride over there. Big ballin'.
Yeah.
So this street race, it's just a lot of people. We've got a vibe, and Brian wants to take the cash and the respect. Offers up his car. Pink slips.
The one thing I wanted to mention in the previous scene that we'll get back to where we're at here with the street racing stuff. Paul Walker, I wrote down, is a handsome young man in this movie, and I was curious how old he was. He was our age when he filmed and released this. So he's 28.
28?
Yeah.
Wow. Good for him.
Yeah. So
Holy
I was like,
smokes.
dang. Because I thought he looked younger in this.
Mm-hmm.
I thought he was like maybe early 20s. And I was like, oh, what was he? Was he like 22, 23 in this movie? And I looked it up. I was like, 28. I'm like, dang. I could be doing better for myself now, couldn't I? So yeah, time to level up my own looks. I think there are some cinematic qualities of this drag racing scene that I would like to touch on, but I want to save that more for when we start touching on the cinematic parts of the movie later on, because I think that's the big standout in this scene, other than him saying "I almost had you" and laughing, and that's a huge meme that I'm obviously aware of.
Inch a mile, yeah.
A lot of my notes here are about the practical effects. Did you have anything else you want to say about the story stuff that happens in this whole section? I mean, obviously they end up running from the cops, and then they go back to Dom's
They run
place.
from the cops, and the one stops when Dom's walking on the street and chases him, which implies that Dom is a known criminal to us, the audience, and that's before we know that he's been in prison, and it was for nearly beating a guy to death. But then we take this diversion after Brian saves him, where Johnny Trans shows up and like pulls him off, shoots up the Mitsubishi. So we're introduced to another rival kind of a gang or group. I think that's kind of interesting. It introduces another player who's possibly the thief here for Brian to find. And so, that kind of leads us then into the party at Dom's house.
Which is where the coolest part of this scene is that Vince is just playing a guitar. And this is the one thing I said I would know that you didn't, is that in this scene, he's playing a Zakk Wylde custom Gibson Les Paul. Zakk Wylde is the guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne's band. And he's had his own band and stuff like that too. But he was like a really prominent metal guitarist in the 90s and 2000s. And that's his like signature guitar. And it's a really, really famous guitar that he is playing. And yeah, that stood out to me, that Vince just has this Zakk Wylde Les Paul, which is probably a couple $1,000 electric guitar.
Okay, good girl. He probably stole it. Probably stole it from somewhere. There's a lot going on in this scene. Vince's kind of bravado's coming out, and you gotta love this one. The Buster kept me out, or whatever. It's so good, and he like the diss of the time was giving him his beer to drink.
Yeah, Vin tries to really win an Academy Award in this scene for a hot minute there.
I love the Buster line. It's so good.
This scene specifically is also when I wrote down, I love the vibe of this movie. I am nostalgic for this. Like just house parties and stuff like that. Again, I never did any of this back in the day, but I was like, oh man, this seems cool. People just chilling out and listening to music, and a man's playing a guitar in a corner. Nowadays, it would just be people trying to, I don't know, everybody's silently looking at their phones in corners of the room or something like that. And I'm guilty of this myself. I don't know. There's just different.
It's a different vibe.
Everybody
different
seems
energy.
Present.
And then, yeah, it's just good. We get more of this Mia Brian type relationship stuff growing, developing. Driving shows Mia is a capable driver. Growing up with Dom.
That's later in the movie, I think, isn't it? Where she drives?
I think that's
their date.
After the party. They get out of the party.
Oh,
maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I thought it was after their date.
It might be. Yeah, her driving is probably after the date, but they do something.
The scene after this is where we find out Brian is a cop.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote down the quote, "You want time, find a magazine."
Yes.
Good quote.
A great quote. I liked how truckers will take matters into their own hands. Like,
yes,
trucker vigilantes are on the loose because of this. So
I wrote down iced cappuccinos look very good, but why decaf?
It was to keep tensions low, keep everyone a little calm.
Iced cappuccinos do look pretty good, though. I need Grant to make me one of those. Look tasty.
Gosh. They do look tasty. This then kind of just leads us in. Brian is getting deeper into the group. He brings the Supra, which will be the kind of one of the cars there at the end. This just leads into race wars. Brian staying undercover. I mean, I'm kind of trying to pick up a little bit here.
I don't know how much. We don't have to run through every single plot detail from here on, because this is where a lot of the story stuff starts happening for sure. The relationships develop. I wrote down oil torture scene.
Yes.
He gets tortured with oil, which is horrible looking. I also don't know what they actually used in that scene, but it looked very bad. I mean, even if it was like, let's say it was chocolate syrup or whatever, it still looked horrible.
Yeah, there was a lot being pumped in for sure.
I wrote down Dom's dad burned alive. Yuck. Yeah, I don't know. This is where a lot of the character stuff starts happening. Then they go on their date, and then there's let's say, grace, and this man prays to the car gods. They go on a date. Yeah, Jesse, which I have a lot of things to say about Jesse and his inevitable fate, because I think that is the funniest part of the entire movie. It's also the worst part of the whole movie. There's not a lot else to say. I mean, blowing through some of this quickly. He goes on his date with Mia, who's using him to kind of get back at Vince. Vince is like a petulant child in this film. That was my knee-jerk reaction to him. Like, he goes and he tries to make some popcorn. She goes on a date with. He says she'll go on a date with Brian instead, and he walks out of the room punching the walls and stuff like that. Like, and I get that that's how he's supposed to be playing, but he's like a toddler in this, and it's very funny to me that he's supposed to come off as like this. I think when he first shows up in the movie, he's supposed to be like a little intimidating, and then the longer you watch it, he's just like a pouting little kid all the time.
That's intentional in the story. Yeah, it's definitely intentional for his character, and ultimately what the climax of the film with the truck chase and highway robbery with him specifically.
I wrote, when they go on their date, I just wrote, is Brian drinking coffee at a 10 p.m. dinner? Because they go on the date and she says, let's go to Cha Cha Cha. How's 10 on Friday sound? And then during that scene, he's drinking a cup of something out of a mug that is steaming. And I'm like, bro, this is the end of your meal. It's probably like 11:30. You drinking coffee right now? You trying to stay up all hours of the night? Which I guess we find out later he is trying to do, technically. So, maybe he's trying to power up there before he takes Mia back to his hot bachelor pad at the auto parts store.
Yeah, it's interesting that he's living there. But I think kind of the two things we should touch on narratively, at least, is the race wars bit, particularly with Jesse, and then the truck kind of leading into this highway robbery and chase and stuff where
Johnny Tran getting arrested falsely, I guess.
And then everyone finds out Brian is a narc. So race wars is just like legal street racing in the desert, and it's Jesse makes the poor decision of pink slips his dad's car against Johnny Tran, not fully knowing what Johnny is running under his car, and that results in him losing and running away from Johnny and that rival gang and stuff, putting him in a dangerous situation. Yeah.
We'll get, when we talk about, there's no spoilers. When we talk about his death, I just need to break down everything that happens leading up to that, because it is so funny and it's so poorly written. I'm sorry, I gotta call out this. I don't think this movie at any one point is like an excellent script or anything like that, but that part in particular is just, actually screw it. Let's just talk about it now, because we're talking about it anyway. Jesse leaves, and then they got the whole they go off that night to go do their robbery thing or whatever. Let's I just need to focus here on Jesse. So Jesse drag races, loses, It's like, oh man. And then he drives off, drives around for roughly 24 hours or so. And you don't see him again until he pulls up in front of Vin's house, or Dominic Toretto's house. And the moment he pulls up, Dom has a shotgun pointed at Brian, and Brian has a pistol pointed at Dom. And he pulls up and jumps out of his car, and he's like, help, I don't know what to do. At a moment where he sees two people have guns pointed at each other, and he's like screaming about his own problems. And then all within this same span of 15 seconds, Johnny Tran and his boys drive by with Uzis and blow him away. So
and
we've
Dom,
got this whole
like, crawls across the front lawn dodging bullets.
Yes, it's just a hilarious sequence of about 15 seconds where they're pointing guns at each other. Jesse drives up, is screaming about his own problems, and then motorcyclists drive by and blow him all away. And then he's dead. Jesse is, I don't know. I don't know why he's in this movie, if I'm being honest, because the final, again, this is jumping more towards, I mean, this is the end of the movie at this point, but they really never eulogize him in any way. They're just like, oh, Jesse's dead. We'll chase the other guys. And then they jump in front of a train. And then he says, I owe you a 10-second car. Like, there's this... No one takes even half a second to be like, oh no, my boy Jesse is dead. They kill his killers, and then they go and have some fun and get a car, swap a car.
They don't actually kill them. They immobilize them. Because
I thought
Brian leaves one and says call 911 like after
That's
that
true.
accident. I think it's an indication of Dom's character. He can be vengeful, and I think that's kind of coming out, especially from his dad, the story about his dad and the guy that crashed into him and stuff. So it's that energy. And then Brian is on a mission to bring Dom in, not only for his job, but also because he does care for Dom and doesn't want Dom to have a murder charge, and he cares about Mia and things like that. So there are those, it's funny, but there are,
I guess the point that I don't understand is why Jesse is in this or has to die in the first place. Because we already established on its own that Johnny Tran has a bone to pick with Dom because Dom beats the piss out of him at Race Wars, which in turn that alone could have ignited him to go want to drive by, shoot up the place or something.
I think what it is family. Jesse is clearly the kid of the group.
I have to know this. Do they ever mention Jesse in any of the other movies, like, extensively, without maybe, like, one line of dialogue?
I don't recall Jesse ever being mentioned again.
Exactly.
It's unfortunate. But in this movie, in the context of this is the only movie, Jesse is clearly the kid of the group. He's the one that has to say grace. He has that moment with Brian where he's like, I'm super smart, but I got that ADD. Like, clearly lights are on, but he's a little bit off. And so he's kind of being fostered in this group. His dad is in jail. He's alone. He's kind of this tragic character within the group. He helps out. He's like the little brother or the kid. And his death is meant there as like a spark of vengeance and injustice. Like, how could you take him out? Why would you take out Jesse? Why wouldn't you, take me instead, kind of thing. And that's kind of his purpose, and it's shallow.
It's just a cluttered mess because we're getting into the final 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, and there's just so much coming to a head at a single time, and it's just all kind of nonsensical and crazy. I even wrote down specifically, the editing during the Jesse death scene is really, really hilarious. Please rewatch this. The slow-mo, the way they cut between things, like they cut between like wide shots and close-up shots, it's really jarring and is all over the place. And there's different I think there's even like different levels of slow-mo going on, like the slow motion
like
scenes
speed of it.
Yeah, like the slow-mo of the guys driving by on the motorcycles and the slow-mo of Dom like crawling across the lawn like does not match up really. It just looks so strange.
It's a good time.
You should rewatch that one scene if you have not and you're listening to this. It's just it's so chopped together. It's all over the place and it's very funny to watch. But the way it's chopped together is not so much so that I'm like, oh, this is bad. It's like, wow, this is just it's so messy that it's like I said, it's funny almost, which is probably not the reaction they wanted when killing off a character. But
Probably not.
If we want to go touch on the race war stuff again for 1 second, I just wrote down, this is really the only thing I have to say about her character in this movie too, is Michelle Rodriguez. I know she becomes a way bigger character in the future movies. In this one, she's really just kind of presented as Dom's girlfriend, and she takes his shirt off in front of a car at one point. But I did write down, Michelle Rodriguez looks very cool in this movie. The sunglasses she's wearing when she's racing in Race Wars, she looks very cool. Those early 2000s sunglasses look cool. Dom wears something like that in this movie too, I believe.
He does when they street race a Ferrari. It is, she is a cool character here, and definitely throughout the whole film asserts kind of her toughness and ability to hold her own throughout the group. You know, she's not, while she is in this movie pretty much just Dom's girlfriend, she clearly has respect within that whole group of people. But she does look very cool, especially racing.
I think the only thing to talk about is the hijack scene plus the revelations of him being a cop to everybody. I think the truck scene is largely cool. The biggest, it's intense. There's a lot going on, I guess. It's probably drastically smaller scale than some of the future films, I would imagine. This is like very bottom of the list as far as stunts and action sequences go in this franchise.
The scope, for sure. Yeah.
It just all boils down to saving Vince at the end of the day, which is kind of an interesting spin to put on it, because
you're not really supposed to like Vince.
Well, you're not really supposed to like Vince, and then coming into it, you're thinking that it might end up coming down to, well, the truck drivers are now going to defend themselves or whatever. But you also, that Brian's trying to get over there and find them, and you don't know if he's going to have to come to a head with Dom or not, if he's going to have to go toe-to-toe with Dom in this situation. And he really doesn't. He ends up kind of teaming up with all of them to save Vince in that situation. It's a cool scene. I think it's a little long at times. I don't know. There's a lot that's going... Not a lot that's going... There's a lot that's going on for sure, but I think there are some sequences where it just feels like it's a little too elongated, and we could have sped up some sections of it.
The truck especially, just him hanging and getting into the truck and all this stuff, it does feel long. I get that it's the climax of the movie, and 2001, this is probably a pretty big set piece for them.
Yeah.
I mean, again... Even like you said, it gets crazier later on. Like the scale of it is definitely the smallest, but this was pretty big at the time, I would think. And It's cool stuff. It's. Do you want to talk about stunts in general now, or do you want to save that for a little bit?
We can probably talk about the stunts now, because this is definitely the big... This, and then the drag race we already talked about, and then the train jumping scene towards the end would be the big stunts of the movie.
The stunts, there's an affinity for practical effects, and I appreciate it. And when it is CG, they use CG in a way that it is, and it's stylized, and it gives that movie texture and flavor. I love the practical effects of this movie.
Yes, I wrote that is 1,000% the best part of this movie, is that this movie has... this is getting into this, touching on the cinematics and stuff like that too, but we may as well. It is by far my favorite element of this movie, is that the visual effects are great because they actually have a stylized, like, cinematic look to them. Like, there is CG used in this movie, yes. Like, at the drag race scene at the start of the movie I mentioned, like, there's a lot of visual effects that are going on.
Especially when NOS is used.
Yeah, but it's in such a way that I don't think it's... it's not fully CG. It's clear that they filmed some of those, like, because it gives it like a look like they're going way faster than they are, but it's clear that they probably filmed that and then just sped it up or something like that. Like, it's not like the environments themselves are not computer generated that you see outside of the car and stuff like that. Again, I'm totally making this up. I don't know for sure, but it looks totally real. Like, all the effects in this movie look very practical. Even even when Johnny Tran blows up the car and it explodes, like, that's a real car they blew up.
And like Vince hanging off the truck. Now, granted, he wasn't actually hanging by one arm, but there's really a semi truck there, and there's just a level of realness and texture that keeps it grounded and makes even a movie like this, as corny as it can be sometimes, have stakes and feel real.
It makes the movie, I wrote down, the entire cinematic look and style of this movie is great. In an age where all big blockbusters feel like they're shot the same way or largely homogenized, this movie stands out a lot. Like, it really does feel like maybe 20 years ago this wouldn't have felt that special, but I guess within our current age, it feels way more unique, which is bizarre in a sense. Like, again, I feel like 15, 20 years ago, you maybe wouldn't have thought too much about this, but now there's just so much CGI present with so many movies. I mean, Star Wars.
And that does become a factor later on in the movies. It's undeniable that these movies lean more into that stuff. But their practical effects are still a part of the series because cars are still characters to some degree.
Yeah.
And it's fun to see that commitment at this level.
Yes, I agree. Like that when they are, even with the truck scene at the end, like,
or the car,
or
even
the train, the train scene. I mean, when they run a car into a semi, they're running a car into a semi there, like, and that's just a brief thing that happens, but they're actually doing that to cars and things like that. Which again, it just doesn't seem like that happens very much. And again, I've not seen all of these movies, and you've said that practical effects are a big part of it, so I'm sure they still do a lot of practical things in the other ones. But I don't know. My brain has been so wired to, when I think of current major blockbusters, I think of, Marvel and Star Wars, and those are like completely devoid of practical effects nowadays. It seems like Star Wars especially has gotten to the point where I feel like it's not as practical as it used to be, and it just feels I don't know. I don't like the thing that Favreau and them made. What is that thing called? The big circular thing they shoot in?
Oh, the Void or something?
Yeah, it feels so distant. Like, it's a really cool piece of technology that they have made, but it leads to everything feeling so... Yeah, everything feels so samey.
Mm-hmm. There's even other moments in this movie, like the big street race at the beginning, where they have all the cars lined up on the street. Those are all essentially real cars. It could have been repeated kind of in the background, but when they all cops and then they run away, like, it's real stunt drivers driving around and stuff. And you'll see that in other movies too as well. And I appreciate it. It feels really good to see that and see it stay at some parts of the movies, but also go away later on in parts. There are parts like, man, I wish that was real instead of in a computer. And I think that it holds, and it's part of what makes the older movies retain quality. It's not like...
It's what makes this still a watchable movie in 2022.
It's not like, you can skip the first 3 movies or whatever. Just skip to 4 or whatever.
No, I think this movie
These
largely...
are still valuable.
From a visual standpoint, I think that this movie really does hold up quite a bit. The one thing that I do have to call out about the hijacking scene, and I don't know if you noticed this, but this was very apparent to me on my Blu-ray version of this I was watching. When he starts to go when Brian realizes where they're at and he starts going to try to save them, it is night and he's with Mia. And then he finds out where they're at and he's like, they're about 40 miles away. Come on, we got to go. And then when they jump to the next scene, it's clear that they're shooting it in midday. However, the movie itself puts on some sort of filter for the first couple minutes of the truck or the semi hijacking scene. It puts on a filter to make it look like it's like the early hours of the morning where the sun's just coming up. And they plaster a very like some sort of darkening filter across those scenes, so it looks like it's earlier in the morning than it really is, but it was clearly all shot in midday. And around a couple minutes into the scene, they just dropped the filter altogether. They're like, yeah, screw it, it's just the middle of the day now, or whatever. The sun is fully out at this point. But the whole scene was clearly shot in midday, and they're like, oh, we'll make it, to connect these scenes, we'll make it look like it's the early morning and the sun's coming up, and we'll put this filter on it. But you can tell it looks so bad. That's the one bad part of the movie, I think, as far as like a visual look, because it's so apparent. But hey, I guess they did what they could with it.
Obviously that becomes less of a problem later on as the movies get bigger budgets and technology gets better and stuff. I think the stunts here are really good. I'm quite impressed. It's all really cool. They even have like a real helicopter come in and pick Vince up.
They do, yeah. I am touching on that. That's when the whole moment happens where he reveals that he's a cop. Do you have anything? I don't really have much to say about that, because even the way it's played in the movie, it's just kind of very, I don't know. Vin has his moment where I
do think Vin Diesel says a lot with his reaction in his face. He's holding back the rage, and that comes out in the driveway later with the Jesse
with
thing.
the shotgun.
Yes, but
then it's interrupted by the Jesse thing. Yeah.
I actually think he does really well there, though, with his face and his reaction to the realization that someone he had now considered a new and close ally and friend is a cop, which represents the one thing Dom will never wants to go back to.
I think that's the one thing that pisses me off. Not pisses me off. I'm not actually mad about it. But that's the one downside of the whole Jesse stuff that I talked about beforehand, is we don't really get to see an actual dialogue play out between Dom and Brian for long before Jesse rolls up and he's like, help, help, and then he dies. And then everything changes on a dime, and eventually we have closure between the two of them, but we don't really get to see. I guess on paper it makes more sense that like if I was constructing a movie script and I was like, okay, we have to find a way for them to come back together. What's a way that could unify them? Oh, they rallied together to avenge their fallen friend or whatever. I think that makes sense, but it's just the way in which it happens in the movie is so quick and it feels so clunky, and then the movie's just over. It's like, okay, huh. Like, I think if they would have revealed that he was a cop a little bit before, like maybe like 30 minutes before the movie ends, like it's really like the last 10, 15 minutes that this all comes about.
I don't know if I entirely, maybe agree is not the right thing. I think they do more later. It's more of an action speak louder than words thing, where they do chase Johnny Tran and his cousin. I'm blanking on his name. But then Brian does chase Dom down. It's not. I think at that point, the facade after Jesse, the "I'm going to arrest you" is dropped, and it's more just, I need to help Dom. He is in a bad spot right now, not just criminally, but he's on kind of this rampage. And they have that moment at the red light. From here to the tracks is a quarter of a mile. I used to race it. Blah blah blah. But he's like, I'm never going back. And I think there's this mutual respect between the two, which ties into that first street races, take the money and take the respect. And after the train, which they both miss, and Dom flipping in the dump truck, I think Brian kind of says it all when he hands him the keys. And I've tried to hold keys like that. I've tried to replicate that, the way he kind of holds them. If you look at the way he holds them
in a real weird way.
Yeah, I can't quite do it. I can't do it like Paul. But he gives him and he lets him escape, which tanks his career. You'll see the implication of that in Too Fast, Too Furious. But it hurts his career and
earns Dom's respect.
But earns the respect and kind of the spot in the family.
And his trust.
Yeah. And that, I think, is the family nugget continuing to hold strong, which is the foundation for the series.
But did they know it was the foundation of the series when they made this movie?
No, because you'll see. I don't want to say anything.
A couple questions, or just things I want to throw out quickly. One, why are Brian's windshield wipers on during the train jump scene? If you watch that scene, his windshield wipers are moving.
Are they really?
Yeah. So they're jumping in. It's the slow motion shot of them both jumping in the train behind him, and his windshield wipers are on.
Okay.
I did not stop this movie after the credits rolled, and I was like, oh, this is like 2001. Post-credit scenes will not be a thing. There is a post-credit scene in this movie, which is kind of fascinating. Ahead of its time in a lot of ways. Is that a thing through all of them? Do I need to skip ahead to the end of all of them?
All of them? There's definitely one in Tokyo Drift. There's definitely one I think there's one in Too Fast, Too Furious. There's definitely one in 6 or 7.
Okay.
It's a few of them. I could probably look it up and come up with a hit list of which ones have it. But yeah, definitely stick around.
I wrote down the quote in the scene where the one guy, what's the Hispanic guy's name, who's kind of at the drag racing scene early in the movie? Is it Hector? Is it Hector? Okay, he comes into the store and he's like, hey, I need 3 of each of these parts. How quickly can I get them? And Brian says, well, we can overnight parts from Japan. I wrote down, wow, world building.
Yeah, Tokyo Drift probably was not in the cards at that point, but yes, Japan definitely. It's kind of a part of street racing and stuff too. They drive a lot of Toyotas and things like that.
Yeah. And those are that's about all I wrote down. I think, I guess the one thing I would like to bring up to you before we kind of touch on a couple other things and with this is it vital that Dom and the rest of the family members be thieves? And I assume so, because I know they rob some things in the later movies. I know there's something like they're dragging a vault down the street or something like that in one of those movies. I have seen that. I think it's really interesting, though, that they chose to make a street racing movie here, but also a heist movie in some senses. Like, because I feel like if I was making this movie, they could have just made it to where street racing is illegal and they want to knock off the street racing stuff. And they could have sent Brian after these street racing gangs or whatever to kind of get an inside with them, and so that they can get to the root of this problem, which is plaguing LA, which is all these different street races. I guess it's weird to me that they're having him invade this street racing inner circle for the purposes of them being thieves rather than it dealing back with the fact that the street races themselves are illegal. I don't know if that makes any sense, what I'm saying.
I get kind of what you're
the thing that he's going after, the thing that he's going them after for is the robberies they're doing, which I guess, I mean, it makes sense that they're committing other crimes too in this.
Crime in their history with crime is essential for most of the movies. It is a part of their characters and identity going forward.
I guess I was going to say, like, if they were not thieves in this movie, robbing semi-trucks and stuff like that, would they have still been able to do things in the future that they do with these characters and stuff like that? Or is that almost super integral to this?
It is definitely a part of their characters in future films. Their ability to steal and do stunts, like dangerous heist things, is essential throughout the movies. At the time, again, they were definitely not thinking that, like, we have master car thieves. It's built upon in later films, for sure. So it is important.
Okay.
They're planting the seed.
That's all I really had written down about the story and the effects and that stuff. Did you want to say anything about that before we maybe touch on a couple other ancillary elements of the...
No, there were just some tidbits of, like, there's a floppy disk that loads up a 3D image of a Toyota Supra.
I like that. I like that
a lot. The barbecue and Grace thing that's established in the first movie here. I also kind of noticed that everyone is ready to commit crime. Like, everyone is ready to, I've got a shotgun. Like, let's break in. We're gonna go bust.
That's really funny. Is that they're just strapped this whole movie, and they just show up and they've got shotguns out of nowhere in this, which is pretty funny a couple times. Because it's very much out of nowhere that they show up and they have these things. Like when Vince shows up and he's got one, he's like, "What are you doing?" And Vince tells Brian he has to choose his words carefully or whatever. The music and the sound design is the next thing we've got written down here that we want to touch on. I don't know how much you want to say about this.
It's very early 2000s hip hop.
Well, I wrote down specifically here. I wrote down this movie has a bomb ass soundtrack. Like it has a lot of those things that I associate with like car culture games and stuff like that, whether it be a lot of the games we mentioned earlier, like Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo is more jazzy, I guess, but Midnight Club, Need for Speed, that kind of stuff. This kind of early 2000s electronic hip hop music. I still associate that music with this whole scene. And so I like the movie in that regard, and I miss that style of music. I've actually been listening to a lot of early 2000s music lately, so this has kind of hit at the right time for me with the soundtrack, at least.
Yeah, it's got that same energy to it. And it continues. This type of
I've
vibe
seen the
soundtrack.
trailers.
Yeah.
I've seen the trailers. I know music is a big part of this franchise for sure. Legacy, I guess, is the final thing that we should touch on here. Or, well, there's two things. We can talk. Actually, let's do this before we touch on the legacy. One refraining thing that we want to do throughout this whole season. If you listen to our Banjo-Kazooie season, we ranked the levels in each of the games that we played, and we're not going to be doing that. But we are going to be listing what we think is the best car from each of these movies. So, Max, best car.
My personal favorite are the Hondas at the start because they're low, fast, black. They're cool. But that's not very exciting. That's not an exciting car. I am definitely partial to the orange Mitsubishi Eclipse that Paul Walker brings to the garage and they revive and is the car he gives at the end. I'm very partial to that car. I think it's sweet.
Yeah, I like the Ferrari a lot that shows up in this, which I know is not probably I'll give an actual street car answer too. I like the green one that he's driving at the beginning, the one that gets blown up by Johnny Train. I think that one looks really cool.
Yeah.
It looks cool when it gets blown up even. I don't know what make and model that is exactly.
That's also an Eclipse, I believe.
I think you might be right, actually.
The orange car is a Supra, so I apologize, car people. It's a Toyota Supra. And then the green car is a Mitsubishi Eclipse, 1995 Mitsubishi.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like the green one a lot. Green car for me is my choice, although I do really like the Ferrari that man is driving in the scene where they decide to race that fella as well, and then they go eat shrimp.
Yeah. Get me in on the action. I don't take handouts. Legacy?
I mean, I think this movie's legacy is twofold. Obviously, one, it started this sprawling multimedia franchise, which we already kind of talked about at the top. And yeah, I mean, this is the first movie in a mega billion-dollar franchise. So there's that. Beyond that, I think it really does serve as a sort of cultural touchstone for, like, when I have kids and you have kids and they're going to be like, Dad, what was it like when you were growing up? I'll be like, well, watch this movie. Like, kind of like how our parents point to, like, probably 80s movies or something. Like, oh, I'm so nostalgic for The Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Like, those movies are emblematic of, like, the 80s and stuff like that. If I was to point to a movie that I feel like would be very emblematic of early 2000s, it would be this. It's got the music, the vibe, the way people even talk in the movie we mentioned, all those things is this just screams early 2000s. The only thing missing really would have been like a Linkin Park needle drop at some point in this movie. It would have been just the cherry on top, or like, I don't even know if the Hybrid Theory was out at this point, but
for me, I think you've nailed it on the head. It spawns a multi-billion-dollar film franchise. It's the start of it all. And it captures a time in life that really movies haven't captured, including the Fast and the Furious haven't really captured that in quite some time. So it's also, personally, it has the name The Fast and the Furious, which is then riffed on throughout Too Fast, Too Furious, Fast and Furious, all this stuff. I think that's a part of it. But I think, like I said at the top, it's the seed for everything. It's the cornerstone. Family, cars, Corona. Those, you can joke about that, but it's the start here. It's this core group
and
of
the characters.
That,
I was gonna say the characters are just as iconic.
Yeah, that I love, and that I definitely believe you're going to fall in love with over the course of these next 9 films that you and I get to watch together. It's special. It's also nice to just see them when they started out in this particular franchise. There's a quality to that I'm really loving this time around with the film.
It's got, even again, as somebody who's coming in saying this is probably the worst mega movie franchise ever, I like this movie. Will I watch this all the time? I don't know, probably not. But it's a good movie. I don't mind it. I have seen it twice now within the span of less than a year, and I really thought I was gonna hate watching this last night again because like I had just seen it not super long ago, and no, I had a good time.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. So well, I think that wraps it up, everybody, for this first episode of season 4 of Chapter Select. Thank you so much for listening, especially if you're in your car and you're driving, you're listening. You know, feels really on brand for this particular season. If you would like to follow us online, you can follow the show at Chapter Select on Twitter. You can follow Logan over on Twitter at Moreman12 and his writing over at comicbook.com. You can follow myself on Twitter at MaxRoberts143 and my writing over at maxfrequency.net. The next episode is Too Fast, Too Furious. We're going in chronological order and narratively. So Too Fast, Too Furious fits as the next piece of the puzzle. So very excited. First one for me, and it holds an incredibly soft spot. So I'm excited to share this one in particular with Logan and explore Miami as we travel around the world in all our cars. So thank you so much. And until next time, adios.
Bye-bye.
Chapter Select is a Max Frequency production. This episode was researched, produced, and edited by me, Max Roberts. Season 4 is hosted by Logan Moore and myself. Season 4 is all about the fast and the furious. For more on this season, go to chapterselect.com/season 4. Follow the show at Chapter Select and check out previous seasons at chapterselect.com.